In Chapter 10, we discussed the growth of Southern life in terms of class as well as in terms of industry. And we learned that in the South, we don't see the growth of industry the same way that we see that in the North. The South remains primarily agricultural through the 1820s and through the 1830s. As the South remains agricultural, we see that about 3% of the population ends up with the majority of slaves owned in the South. Somewhere between 50 and 100 being the average number that 3% of white Southerners held, and those being concentrated on very, very large plantations. We learned that about 17% of the population of Southerners had between 3 and 6, but typically less than 10 slaves. But we also learned that the majority of Southerners did not own slaves at all because they were extremely poor. They were immigrant groups, yeoman farmers, as well as landless laborers. And as these developments are taking place within the plantation, there are some important developments that take place. We see the role of the plantation mistress or the wife of the master begin to shift, and she sort of becomes a manager of all things domestic. So the manager of her home as well as the manager of slaves' homes and slaves' quarters. In the same vein, we see that there are slaves that are domestic, that primarily work within the home, and we see slaves who work in the fields. And we know that those experiences are different depending on the comfort of the home with additional overseer eyes from the white owners and the more harsh outside conditions that may offer a little more freedom and a fewer prying eyes. We also learned that in the 1830s, we start to see an increase in slave resistance and slave rebellion. And we specifically discussed the different types of passive and overt resistance. Passive resistance being pretending to be sick and pretending to, be unable to work. We learn about the more overt resistance in which a slave might break tools, might try to decrease production. And then we also learned about rebellion. And when we learned about rebellion, we specifically learned about Nat Turner, who led a massive rebellion in 1831 in which more than 50 slave owners and their families and children were killed. Nat Turner, of course, and those who had allied with him were eventually captured and executed. Importantly, many slaves who had nothing to do with Nat Turner's rebellion were also executed. So this week we're going to talk about the developments that are taking place at the same time in the northern cities and in the northern areas. This chapter is entitled Social and Cultural Ferment in the North. So at the same time that we see changes in the South, we see some changes in northern areas as well. Particularly in northern areas, we see an increase in the number of immigrants coming into the United States after the 1820s. In particular, German and Irish immigrants, as well as Scottish. And as these immigrant groups are coming into the United States, they are increasing the diversity of the cities, increasing the diversity in terms of culture, in terms of faith, and in terms of custom. We see a combination of environmental factors as well as economic policies in the 1830s and in the 1840s that really result in massive, massive immigration from Ireland. By 1850, the Irish constituted 40% of all immigrants in the United States. And of course, immigrants came to the United States specifically looking for jobs, looking for safety, and they went where the jobs were, which was primarily in the northern areas, which had begun to industrialize in the early 1800s. We also see that in the northern areas there were a lot of leisure pursuits or fun activities that stemmed across all social classes. Now, the activity that you might pursue, of course, would vary depending on the amount of money that you had, but people had enough money that they had some excess money to spend on their wants and not just their needs. Cities also attracted a lot of young people, both married and single. This chart illustrates the immigration trends in the United States, and I'd like to point to the German, Irish, and British folks coming into the United States. Again, we see that this is about identical between 1820 and 1830. However, about 1838 forward, we see that there's a steep incline, again, with the Irish being the highest incline. Here we see the total number of immigration reaching close to 450,000 immigrants in the United States. With an increase in diverse cultures taking place in the cities. But of course, with this increase in diversity, in many of these cases, immigrants are met with resistance and sometimes with violence. We see a backlash against immigration groups. I'm sorry, a backlash amongst immigrant groups, particularly from native born, meaning born in the United States, Protestants. This resulted in crude stereotypes and caricatures of new culture. Many of the immigrant groups coming into the United States were not Protestant. We do see a large number being Catholic. So we see Protestant versus Catholic discrimination. And importantly, we see a lot of crude stereotypes. Probably the most famous one is the drunk, angry Irishman. And, those Irish are lazy and they drink all day and they fight and they're not good workers and all of those things that are really applied to all immigrants, but especially to all Irish immigrants. There were many racial minorities who moved to the cities in the early 1800s looking for jobs. Just as most immigrants were coming into those northern areas, we also see blacks from the South, free blacks and runaway slaves also looking for employment opportunities. And they also faced discrimination, which decreased their opportunity for finding jobs. There were many affluent residents in the cities who took advantage of the transportation that had been developed and as well as innovations that also existed. They began to move away from the urban centers, and this gives rise to an urban population, which is matched with an increase in crime as well as other dangers. So what takes place is the upper middle class, the middle class, the very wealthy leave the urban areas, the cities, when there's this increase in immigration because they can afford to do so. And what happens is the apartments and the housing in the urban areas is inhabited by the many different and diverse groups that are immigrating into the United States. Now, I want to stress that with an increase in crime, we with the increase in immigration, we see an increase in crime. That does not mean that immigrants bring crime with them to the United States. What it means is that when we see many people clustered in a small area competing for resources, competing for jobs, competing for food, competing for housing, the inevitable result of limited resources and an increase in the people competing for those resources is crime. There was competition for jobs, and that of course increased violence in the bigger cities, particularly Irish immigrants who competed with free blacks. And both of these groups were really at the bottom of the economic ladder and continued to be engaged in conflict, often violent conflict with one another. We see growing crime rates and increased sensitivity to urban dangers due largely to the improvements in the printing and the development of the telegraph. Um, with the telegraph, we are able to more quickly disseminate information. And one of the results of this increase in technology, as well as the sensitivity to urban dangers, is that we see the beginning of a actual community-based police force. Until this time, there might be marshals who sort of govern certain areas or certain states, but very few police officers in terms of regular patrols who would be out and about ensuring that folks were protected. So again, with the increase in immigration and competition for resources, we later see a creation by demand for the police department. We also see a middle class as we are seeing an increase in immigrant groups coming into the United States. Again, new immigrants, racial minorities being at the bottom of the economic ladder, the poorest people. But a new and growing middle class emerged in the first half of the 19th century. Members of the middle class were primarily identified by their education, by their religious affiliation, and by their sobriety. So to make sure you have those three, members of the middle class are really identified by education, religious affiliation, and their sobriety. We would see that the middle class had some level of formal education. They attended church and were usually Protestant, and they were sober in that they did not drink any form of alcohol or only drank a small amount of alcohol in a social setting. They were also identified by their adherence to the notion of very separate and specific spheres for men and women. Remember, the poorest groups of people will have men and women, husbands and wives, mothers and fathers, who will need to work to support the family. But for the middle class, the role of the wife of the mother of the female is primarily defined to the home, to domestic roles. The cult of domesticity seemed to restrict wives to the home, but middle-class women also took on public roles as wives and mothers, where they were expected to model a good Christian wife and a good Christian mother in public. Women and families were important to the changing of the consumer society because they helped to fuel what is known as the growing market economy. Women were primarily responsible for shopping, for purchasing foods and items that the family needed. Most middle-class women still did a significant amount of domestic labor within their home, as servants were typically only available to the wealthiest, the upper middle class, and the very wealthy. Middle-class men, middle-class men also participated in the consumer economy through their jobs as well as leisure activities. In the North, we also see the rise of industry, particularly factory towns. In the 1820s, investors and manufacturers built factory towns like Lowell, Massachusetts, as planned communities for their employees, many of whom were the daughters of the New England farming family. In places like Lowell, Massachusetts, what we see is the entire neighborhood is really built around this concept of family. but also around this concept of protecting particularly the New England daughters. And so these towns would have everything that one might need: a grocery store, a church, perhaps a clinic where a doctor might visit. And so there was really no need for the family to leave the factory town. The factory work, importantly, it provided an extra income for the female laborers as well as their farming families, and offered the towns a safe environment, as well as cultural opportunities. In particular, many women, young women, would take jobs in factory towns with the hope of saving money in order to increase their appeal to male suitors and hopefully elevate their status. They were also often responsible for helping to support their families. We see changes in working conditions and working responsibilities in the 1830s, which made the factory work less appealing. And as a result, factory workers began striking to improve their circumstances. As you recall from chapter 10, we're seeing an increase in the amount of cotton and other products being produced or grown in the South, and those products are being sent to northern factories and northern mills. As a result of that, we're seeing more and more factories needing to turn out more and more finished goods to either sell to the West, to the South, to folks in the North, or worldwide. These This increase in demand for product made working conditions very unsafe, and so workers began to strike. But the strikes really don't do anything to protect the worker because there are no protections for the workers. Today, in 2020, we have the ability as workers to be protected from violence, threats of being fired because we are too sick to go to work. But in the 1830s, there are no protections like this for the workers. And so workers do try to organize, but there's really no protection for those who do organize. Mechanization results in less expensive and more readily available products. But as a result of that, we see a decline in skilled workers. With that decline in the need for skilled workers, we see a decline in the status and pay of skilled laborers. So, for example, if you were a candle maker and you were the only person in a town who could make candles, then you would make very nice candles, and they might have painting on the side. They might have a certain scent, they might have a certain burn life, and so they would be relatively expensive, but they would be something that you could earn a living by producing. But with this mechanization, what we see is the ability of anyone who can pour some wax and push a button to turn out massive, massive, massive amounts of candles. This will, of course, decrease the price of the candle, which means more people can buy those candles. But it also decreases the likelihood that the consumer will buy your candle as a skilled laborer when they can buy the same thing from a factory much, much cheaper. So think of that when you are out buying goods and services and you're looking at the price on those items. Workers also sought relief through what was called a mutual aid society or religious revivals, fraternal orders, and other political involvement. These mutual aid societies would collect funds from the upper middle class, the middle class, and the wealthiest, and disseminate those funds and those services among the poor that they believe to be most deserving. So, of course, racial minority groups don't really benefit from these mutual aid societies, and neither do the Irish. Male workers begin to band together to form unions like we see today, with the goal of fighting for improved working conditions, as well as improved and increases in wages. Some of the unions, like the National Trades Union, were only open to skilled male laborers. Most other unions are only open to white laborers or white laborers who speak English, and this will remain the case through the 1920s and 1930s. So diversity among the laborers makes it very, very difficult to organize, because even though they share the same frustrations and they have common experiences, they are still divided along racial lines. At the same time that we're seeing this decline in skilled labor and these increasing hard, unfair labor conditions in factories, we also see an economic crisis that begins to take place where there are no jobs. And so even though laborers may feel that they are not paid fairly or a living wage, they're willing to keep that wage because it's the only job that is available. And then finally, the excuse me, the Panic of 1837 impacts Northerners first. It will impact Southerners later. But what takes place is that factories and other businesses begin to lay off workers. They begin to lower employee wages or go bankrupt completely. And so when we see workers being laid off, what we see is a increase in unemployment, which means now we have more people who are going to be competing for jobs. Some businesses do stay open, but they lower the employee's wage, and if the employee is unwilling to work for the lower wage, then they are now unemployed. This economic crisis really accelerates the pace of the changes that have already been taking place in the industry in terms of shifting to mechanization and the use of cheap, unskilled labor rather than skilled labor. So, one example that I would like to mention here is I've never had to, I'm not very good at sewing. And in fact, I know how to thread a needle and I can put some stitches in, but that's about as good as I can do with sewing. However, if my job were to thread a needle to a large machine and put a seam in a pair of pants at the Hanes factory outlet, I could certainly do that. I could push the button and produce the product, even though I don't have the skill to actually make pants myself. And so this mechanization decreases the value that we place on the worker. This economic crisis begins in 1837 and will remain in place until the late 1840s. When the panic ended, the technological advances led to the creation of more jobs, even though we see a shift in mechanization. As Americans, we begin to innovate, we begin to create new products, we begin to shift to more mechanization, which means that we need more and more unskilled laborers. At the same time, we also see that there are many new labor organizations that emerge after this panic ends, but the changes in labor, particularly a decrease in the number of female factory workers and an increase in the number of immigrant workers, complicated the demands for those organizations because, again, of course, most immigrant groups are excluded from participation in these organizations. Private charitable organizations provided limited aid um, at this during these these tough financial times, but their efforts were often supplemented by local forms of public assistance where towns or counties and communities would band together to help those who were in need. Of course, racism plays a large role in how these funds are distributed, and in particular, minorities not receiving equal access, immigrant groups, especially immigrant groups who still acted like the Irish or sounded like the Irish, would receive less access to that funding. And equally importantly, a husband who had been laid off might not receive his family may not receive very much support if he was deemed to be a drunk or a bad husband, a bad father, or a bad provider. So we see discrimination in the way that charitable organizations do disseminate funds across the communities in the North.